Hi guys. I wanted to answer your questions about the incident in Minneapolis this summer. I live about 15 blocks from the site that George Floyd was killed. And when he was killed, a series of protests broke out. And so the day after he was killed, I went down to his neighborhood, or the neighborhood that the site was, and just started taking photographs. I wasn't assigned with anybody. I just went there to kind of see what was going on. And I posted those photos on Facebook. My friend Mike Shum, who previously lived in Nairobi but now lives in Minneapolis, he's a cinematographer. He called me the next day and said, "Hey, the New York Times is looking for somebody to be a producer on some stories about George Floyd. Are you willing to take the job?" I said, "Absolutely." And then that night was the night that the third precinct burned down in Minneapolis, the third precinct police department. So there were a series of incidents that happened, three significant ones in the time between when George Floyd was murdered to about 6 weeks later. The majority of them happened kind of the first week after he was murdered. So, I have HEFAT training. I've worked all over the world and was somewhat prepared to kind of work in conflict. But there was a significant and very obvious aggressive nature by the Minneapolis Police Department against protesters and against the media. It was a concerted and purposeful push to intimidate journalists who were reporting on police misconduct and the George Floyd death and George Floyd's death. So throughout the first kind of week or two, I was pepper sprayed, tear gas, probably a dozen times. Throughout that time, I had my camera on me, which is a large DSLR. I was next to Mike, who was carrying an FS7 camera, which goes over your shoulder, so it's obviously a large camera. We at times yelled, "We're press, we're press." There was absolutely no doubt that we were members of the media throughout this process. Every time that we were tear gassed, we were identifying as journalists. Kind of the two more significant episodes and the incidents that I am suing the Minneapolis Police Department occurred at a second site, which was the fifth precinct in Minneapolis, which is even closer to my house. It's about 10 blocks. One of the nights there was a curfew. It was an 8 p.m. curfew, and press are exempt from curfews, and there were a lot of people gathering down at that police precinct to protest the death of George Floyd. And so we went down there at 8 o'clock to start seeing if anything would happen. We had press badges on, we had flak jackets on, we had ballistic helmets on, we had gas masks, the whole thing. There was no question that we were journalists. And just as 8 p.m., it turned 8 p.m., the police came out, or law enforcement came out into the street, formed a giant line, 2 or 3 or 4 officers deep, and you overheard one time only, "This is the Minneapolis Police Department. You are violating curfew and you need to leave." And no more than maybe a minute or 2 minutes. They just started indiscriminately shooting canisters of tear gas and projectiles, rubber bullets and other projectiles. And the media had been kind of sequestered into one area because at that point we knew that they were targeting us, and we thought, okay, if we're all together, perhaps they'll realize that we're media and they won't shoot at us. But unfortunately, that we were very wrong. So the police started pushing forwards towards us while shooting tear gas and rubber bullets. We started running. And by law, the police are obliged to give you an exit route. And the only exit route was kind of one direction. So I start running, and they're shooting indiscriminately kind of into the crowd. And I see concrete barrier. And so I had noted it before, and I knew it had an entrance and an exit. At least I thought it did. So I ran with my other producer, who does not have HEFAT training. I grabbed her and I ran into this kind of alcove along with a lot of other journalists, because we were all kind of thinking the same thing, like, we'll just go in and out the other side, and we'll have some sort of concrete protection. But when we got in, we realized that the exit had been closed. And so we were all stuck in this alcove. And this was as the police department was pushing down the street and there was no other exit. And so I realized that we were soon going to be stuck in there with law enforcement pushing us out. And so I grabbed the assistant producer, pulled her out, and pulled myself out back into the tear gas, and got out in enough time to round the corner and get out. But unfortunately, the cinematographer that I was with also had the same idea, but he was about 20 seconds behind me. And so by the time he realized that the police were pushing into this alcove, it was too late, and they came in with batons, mace, pepper spray, and severely injured a number of journalists in this small alcove. And my cinematographer that I was working with, he tried to jump over this very tall wall to get out and was actually pushed off the wall by a Minneapolis Police Department officer, or I should say a law enforcement officer in Minnesota. We don't know who that person was. They were all wearing various colored like uniforms, and so it was very hard to identify who was who, but we have it all on film. We initially actually thought that it was maybe just another protester that was trying to get over the wall and accidentally pushed him. But when he reviewed the footage, did see that it was a Minneapolis or a Minnesota law enforcement official who pushed him over the wall. And at that point, I was severely tear gassed as well. Second incident was later that evening. We were driving around the city. Things were getting progressively worse. At one point, a law enforcement official pointed a projectile gun at me. And as I had my hands up and I was yelling, "Press, we're press," and he said, "I don't care." And he was saying, "I'm just going to get her. I'm going to get her." And he was pointing this projectile gun at me, and I have a photo of him as well. But later in that night, we were driving around the city. It was maybe like 1 a.m. or 12. We were just about to kind of wrap up, but we wanted to go back to the George Floyd site just to kind of get a wrap-up shot. We turned down one of the roads, and the police had barricaded some of the roads. And what they were doing is they were moving all around the city, kind of locking down these blocks, but you would never know where they were until you got there. Like there was no planned kind of sequestering of roads. And so we just got to this road, and it was a one lane back and forth road, but there were cars parked on each side of it. And so it was like really you could only fit one car down this road. And I saw them, and there was nowhere for me to go, except I saw on the right-hand side there was an alleyway right before it kind of got to the police line or the National Guard line, maybe like 1,000 feet or something before them. And so I slowly came out. I was slowly driving forward. I yelled out the window, "We're press," and I put my right hand turn signal to show that I was going down the alleyway, that I had no intention of driving towards them or into them at all, that I just wanted to turn onto this alleyway because I could not turn around. And I was just yelling, "We're press," and they just started shooting pepper balls at my car. Pepper balls sound like metal, and when they explode, they can shatter your windows on your car, but they also emit chemical irritant. So it's a lot like being tear gassed, but the problem was that I was driving. So it was very, very dangerous. I saw that there was a gap between two cars that were parked on the side of the road. And so I kind of like backed quickly into it and tried to pull a U and kind of went back and forth, like as they're shooting into my car until I finally was able to turn around and drive away. But it was terrifying. I could not see, I could not breathe because our windows were down trying to yell to them, "We're press." So all of these chemical irritants actually got into the car. I was extremely shaken by the whole thing, shaken by the egregious nature of law enforcement in not caring at all that we were members of the press. So yeah, so I was approached by the ACLU after giving my testimony to the Press Tracker organization, and they decided that they wanted me to sign on to a civil suit against the Minneapolis Police Department. My physical symptoms are minimum right now. I was tear gassed quite severely along with the other press and had residual eye inflammation that made it difficult to see sometimes. And also I couldn't wear contacts for about 4 or 5 weeks after the demonstrations, which is not easy if you're looking through a camera to wear glasses with a mask because they fog up. So I went to the ophthalmologist 2 or 3 times and have the cost of that plus just time lost because my eyes were so irritated. I would wake up and my eyes would be blood red and it just would not go away. And finally, when I went to the doctor, they said, "This is from tear gas. This is from a chemical irritant. We don't have any question about that." But I think, some of the residual side effects psychologically were difficult for the first few months. I had a really hard time being around loud noises, fireworks, people accidentally slamming doors, people yelling. I was on kind of a heightened alert all the time. I absolutely distrust police now. There was no question that they were deliberately targeting press, and it was quite horrifying to witness in my own city. I had nightmares for several weeks afterwards, And I'm really lucky that I was not physically injured aside from my eye inflammation, but I definitely had some residual psychological impact after being attacked by law enforcement here.